A Montana winter was never gentle, but the night the mountain called, even the wind seemed afraid. Inside a small cabin carved into the ridge, a retired Marine sat in silence, until his German shepherd lifted his head, ears sharp as blades. A sound drifted through the blizzard, one cry, thin as thread, then another sinking beneath the snow. John Harrington knew that voice wasn't meant to reach him. Yet it did. What he found buried in the white darkness would reveal a truth the whole town had ignored, one drilled into the heart of the mountain. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe every cry deserves to be heard, hit subscribe now. Winter pressed heavily over Cold Ridge, Montana, its breath sharp enough to slice through wool and bone. Snow smothered the streets in white silence, the kind that swallowed footsteps and memories with equal hunger. Inside the church's soup kitchen, warmth clung weakly to the air, barely keeping pace with the cold that seeped through every crack of the old wooden walls. John Harrington sat alone at one of the long folding tables, his massive frame hunched over a bowl of steaming chicken soup. Even at 65, John looked like a man carved from stone and storms. His shoulders were broad, his arms still powerful beneath a faded military jacket, and his hands bore thick layers of callus that mapped the decades he had spent wielding rifles, hauling wounded men from fire, and burying brothers he could not save. His face, weathered by war and winters, carried deep lines etched by grief, duty, and a loyalty that had cost him more than he ever confessed. His silver-gray beard framed a jaw too stubborn to surrender to age, though his eyes told another story. They were pale blue, clouded around the edges, the eyes of someone who had stood too close to tragedy for too long. By his feet lay Bruno, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat and alert amber eyes that scanned every corner of the room. The dog's ears flicked with each sound, every tiny shift in the kitchen, as if ready to protect John at a moment's notice. Bruno had scars beneath his fur, evidence of fights he had survived before John adopted him from a shelter. The shelter worker had described the dog as difficult and distrustful. John had simply knelt, looked the frightened dog in the eyes, and said, "It's all right. I know what it feels like to lose your place in the world." Bruno had chosen him instantly. Now the dog never left his side, guarding him with a quiet intensity only shared between two souls that understood abandonment too well. John lifted a spoonful of soup but hardly tasted it. He ate because his body demanded it, not because he felt hunger. Hunger, he often thought, was for people who still hoped to build something. He was no longer sure what future remained for a soldier who had survived every war except the one inside his chest. The church kitchen smelled of bread, broth, and old wooden pews. A few elderly volunteers washed dishes near the sink, their voices gentle but weary. Outside the frosted windows, snow fell in heavy clumps, dragging the world into an even deeper quiet. John found some comfort in that quiet. It matched the silence inside him. Suddenly the front door swung open, letting in a gust of icy air that scattered napkins across the tables. A woman stepped inside, brushing the snow off her shoulders as she pushed the door closed behind her. She wore a thick wool coat that hung awkwardly on her tall, slightly angular frame. Her hair was a mix of gray and dark blonde, pulled into a loose bun under a knitted hat. Her features were sharp, but softened by exhaustion, as though life had worn her down, yet left her dignity intact. This was Sarah Wilcox, a courthouse administrative officer known around Cold Ridge as a woman who worked hard, stayed polite, and rarely complained. At 55, she carried a quiet toughness earned over decades of raising 2 children alone after her husband died in a logging accident. Coldridge had shaped her into someone who could smile through hardship, yet never turn away from duty, no matter how unpleasant. She scanned the room, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air lingering around her coat. When her eyes landed on John, something in her expression shifted. Respect, maybe, or sympathy, or that cautious recognition small-town people had when they saw a veteran who had clearly been carrying too much alone for too long. "Is there a Mr. John Harrington here?" she asked, her voice steady but loud enough to rise above the chatter of volunteers. John straightened with a slow heaviness, the kind that came from years of marching through mud, snow, and battlefields where every movement cost something. Bruno snapped to alertness, lifting his head and tracking the woman with sharp eyes. "I'm John," he said. Sarah nodded once and stepped toward him, her boots leaving prints of melting snow on the floor. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with the courthouse stamp. When she held it out to him, her voice softened. "This is for you. It's regarding the estate of your grandmother, Martha Harrington. I was asked to deliver it personally." John stared at her. For a moment he did not move. The name Martha felt like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading through memories he had pushed so deep he thought they were gone. His grandmother had been the one person who wrote him letters during deployment. She prayed for him, sent him birthday cards he rarely answered, and told him God had a way of guiding wounded souls home, even when they had forgotten what home felt like. John swallowed hard and took the envelope. His hand trembled slightly, a movement he hoped Sarah did not notice. The paper was worn at the edges, as though it had been held by someone who knew their time was running out. Bruno nudged John's leg, sensing the shift in his breath. Sarah offered a small, kind smile before stepping back. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Harrington. She seemed like a wonderful woman. The courthouse handled her final papers months ago, but you were difficult to locate. The key inside belongs to a property she left in your name." John nodded, unable to form words. Sarah pulled her coat tight around her shoulders and walked back to the door. Snow rushed in behind her as she left. The kitchen felt colder after she was gone. With slow, deliberate hands, John opened the envelope. Inside was a brass key with a blue ribbon tied around it, worn and faded. Beneath it rested a folded note written in a familiar, shaky cursive. He recognized his grandmother's handwriting immediately. "If you still know how to listen, come home. God never abandoned you." John stared at the words until they blurred. Bruno rested his head on John's knee, giving a soft, low whine, almost as if urging him to breathe. Something inside him shifted. Something old. Something buried. Maybe, he thought, some doors were meant to find you even after you had convinced yourself you were no longer worthy of entering them. The chapter closes as Bruno pressed his nose gently against the paper, letting out a quiet whine that sounded very much like agreement. The climb toward the ridge began before sunrise, when the sky over Coldridge carried the faintest ribbon of pale blue behind a curtain of winter clouds. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but John Harrington welcomed it. Cold had always been easier to face than the heat of war. Cold asked nothing of him. It simply existed, honest and unforgiving. He tightened the straps of his old canvas backpack, tugged his wool collar higher around his neck, and gave Bruno a small pat behind the ear before they stepped off the bus at the edge of town. The driver, a heavy-set man named Arthur Blevins, had given John a thoughtful nod before closing the doors. Arthur was in his late 50s, with thinning black hair, a soft, round chin hidden behind a salt and pepper beard, and hands scarred from years working oil fields before bad knees forced him into driving routes. He had a gentle temperament, but life had bruised him in ways simple conversation could not heal. Still, people trusted him. When he said, "Take care up there, Mr. Harrington. Storm might come tonight," the words felt like a quiet blessing. John thanked him and turned toward the mountain path. The road curved away behind the spruce trees, leaving only silence and the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. Bruno trotted beside him, his thick coat dusted with frost, his breath forming white bursts in the air. The dog moved with purpose, as if he already knew where they were going. John found comfort in that. He did not fully understand why the letter and the key had shaken something inside him, but Bruno acted as if the path forward had been written long before the envelope ever arrived. As they climbed higher, the forest deepened. Snow lay heavy on the branches, bending them like tired shoulders. The wind hissed through pine needles, and somewhere far back in the valley, a raven cried out, its call echoing faintly against the granite walls. John's legs ached, but the ache was familiar, even welcome. He had marched through deserts, jungles, and mountains on foreign soil. Climbing one more ridge in Montana felt almost like an old ritual. When the trees finally parted, the house emerged from the slope as if it had been grown rather than built. It stood small and weather-beaten, its cedar planks worn silver by years of snow and wind. The front wall leaned slightly, but held, reinforced by hand-cut beams. The round window near the roof was fogged on the inside, giving the house a quiet, watchful expression. The back wall disappeared directly into the rock, as though the mountain was cradling it in a granite embrace. John stopped, breath catching. For a long moment he said nothing. Childhood images flickered across his mind. Martha Harrington humming while stirring tea, the warmth of quilts stitched from old shirts, her wrinkled fingers resting on the edge of the table as she told him stories about mountains that breathed and rivers that remembered every traveler who crossed them. He had dismissed those stories back then, calling them fairy tales. Now, standing before the home she left behind, he felt something stir, an echo of the faith she had once tried to place in him. Bruno pressed gently against his leg, as if sensing him drift into memory. "All right, boy," John murmured. "Let's see what she wanted us to find." The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he approached the door. He slid the brass key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, stiff with age, then turned with a soft click. The door opened into darkness that smelled of cedar, cold blankets, and faint traces of dried herbs. The scent hit him so suddenly he had to stop again. It was her scent. Time had dulled it, but not enough to erase the memory. He stepped inside. The room was small but arranged with care. A potbelly stove rested in the corner. A few folded quilts lay stacked neatly on a narrow bed, and shelves lined with jars of dried leaves and preserved berries filled one wall. Beneath the circular window stood a small wooden table with a chair worn smooth from years of use. On the table lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked around the edges, and faint embossing marked the words, "For the one who knows how to listen." John brushed frost from the surface with his thumb. His heartbeat quickened as he opened the first page. The handwriting inside belonged unmistakably to Martha. Strong strokes softened by old age, every letter curved with intention. He read the lines silently. "This mountain breathes. The water beneath it is the breath God gave this land. If people drill without thought, if they carve into the earth for profit, the mountain will suffer and the children of this valley will thirst. Listen to the pulse. It will guide you. John closed the journal and exhaled slowly. He had always known his grandmother as a kind woman, rooted in small routines and quiet faith. He had never imagined she carried secrets, or that she believed she was safeguarding something bigger than herself. Bruno moved suddenly. His claws scraped lightly across the wooden floor as he approached a narrow section of planks near the bed. The dog sniffed, ears twitching, then pawed at a faint seam John had not noticed before. "What is it, partner?" John asked softly. Bruno pawed again, more insistent this time. John crouched, running his fingertips along the seam until he felt the subtle dip of a hidden edge. He slid his hand beneath a loose plank and lifted. The wood rose with surprising ease, revealing a recessed hatch frame beneath it. Cold air wafted upward from the darkness inside, carrying a scent of stone, minerals, and something faintly metallic. A wooden ladder disappeared into the depths below. John's throat tightened. He had seen hidden spaces before, underground storage rooms in war zones, emergency shelters in ruined villages. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, personal. He picked up Martha's journal again, holding it to his chest for a brief moment. "You were trying to tell me something," he whispered. "I'm listening now, Grandma." Bruno nudged his arm gently, amber eyes bright with alertness. The dog's stance was ready, curious, unafraid. John closed the hatch for the moment but kept his hand on it as he stood. He took a slow breath, steadying the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "We start tomorrow." The chapter ends as the winter light dimmed beyond the fogged round window, and John stood in the small, silent house with Bruno at his side, holding Martha's journal and whispering, "I'm listening." The morning light crept slowly across the cedar floorboards of the mountain house, faint and cold, as if unsure whether it belonged there. John Harrington sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the leather-bound journal of his grandmother resting in his calloused hands. Bruno lay beside him, head on his paws, amber eyes fixed on the hatch in the floor, as though he had dreamed of it all night. John had not slept well. He had woken several times, the whisper of memories pulling him between soldier instinct and grandson grief. But when the sun finally brushed the round window with a thin halo of silver, he understood that today he needed to see what Martha had hidden beneath the floor. He lifted the wooden hatch carefully, feeling its weight, and lowered himself down the steep wooden ladder with slow, deliberate steps. Bruno followed without hesitation, moving with the controlled agility of a dog accustomed to complex terrain. When John reached the bottom, he paused to adjust to the dim light. The chamber was small, carved directly into the stone. The air smelled of damp earth and old minerals, sharp like river pebbles warmed by sunlight. A wooden work table sat against one wall, its surface scratched and uneven. On it rested a set of old headphones connected to a weather-beaten metal box with coils of wire looping from its frame. John approached the device with a soldier's caution. The casing was dented, its knobs worn smooth from decades of use, and a faint blue glow pulsed near the dial, as if the machine were alive. He placed the headphones gently over his ears. A soft hum greeted him at first, like wind passing through a hollow tree. Then came the deeper sound, water. Not the playful chatter of a stream or the heavy rush of a river, but a slow, rhythmic pulse, steady and ancient. It reminded him of a heartbeat, a low thrum echoing through stone. But every few seconds the sound stuttered, breaking into a harsh vibration, like the lungs of an elderly man struggling to breathe. He removed the headphones and exhaled. His grandmother had written about the pulse of the mountain, describing it as a sign of the land's health. If the pulse faltered, Martha warned, the water vein could collapse or dry up. John ran his fingers over the pages of the journal lying beside the machine. Her entries were written in a trembling but determined hand. They said no one would believe me. They said industry was the future. But I have listened for decades. I know when something is wrong, the drilling, the pumping, the shortcuts. They will break the mountain from the inside. John closed the journal with a heaviness pressing on his chest. He was not an environmentalist. He had spent his life serving the country in places where survival often mattered more than principles. But this was his grandmother's life's work, her voice preserved in ink. And something inside him, the part that survived mortar blasts and lost friends, told him this was no superstition. He climbed out of the chamber, Bruno following close behind. After a quick breakfast of canned beans, John strapped on his winter jacket and headed toward town with Bruno trotting at his side. The forest trail was quiet except for the distant tapping of woodpeckers and the crunch of fresh snow beneath his boots. As he descended the ridge, the town of Cold Ridge spread below him like a quilt of weathered rooftops and narrow streets lined with old lampposts. His first stop was the church, where Reverend Thomas Galen was sweeping snow from the steps. The Reverend was a man in his late 60s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver hair combed neatly back and a long face softened by deep-set, gentle eyes. He had served the town for over 40 years and carried the weary kindness of someone who had buried too many parishioners and comforted too many grieving families. His voice always carried a hint of sorrow, shaped by the death of his only daughter decades earlier. When John approached, Reverend Galen paused and leaned on his broom. "Martha's grandson," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "I wondered when you'd come speak to me." John explained the hidden room, the strange device, the journal entries. The Reverend listened quietly, brows drawn together, then nodded slowly. "The old wells near the South Ridge began to dry up last spring," he admitted. "Families complained about the taste of their water. I smelled it myself. Metallic, unnatural. Cold Ridge water said it was sediment, nothing more." His gaze drifted toward the mountains. But Martha knew things others didn't want to hear. After leaving the church, John walked to the small town library. The building was warm, lit by soft yellow lamps that cast long shadows across the shelves. The librarian on duty was Helen Briscoe, a petite woman in her mid-40s, with curly brown hair pinned back and round glasses slipping down her nose. She had a habit of speaking softly but moving quickly, the result of juggling 3 children at home and a job that often demanded patience. Helen greeted John with a reserved smile. "You look like a man carrying questions," she said. When John asked about Cold Ridge water, she pressed her lips together. "People don't say it out loud, but trucks have been driving up the mountain at night. My husband works maintenance at the plant. Last week he came home pale as a sheet. Said something was wrong with the pressure gauges. They warned him not to ask questions." John thanked her and walked back into the winter air. His mind churned as he and Bruno made their way toward the edge of town. As he crossed a small bridge, he saw 2 elderly residents standing near a frozen stream. One, a gray-haired woman bundled in a purple coat, complained about a strange smell in her tap water. The other, a thin man with a weathered face, spoke about how his backyard well had gone dry for the first time in 50 years. Their voices trembled not just with age, but with worry. By the time John reached the halfway point back up the ridge, The sky had begun to darken. Snow flurries drifted in the air, dancing like white ash. Bruno stopped suddenly, ears snapping forward. John followed the dog's gaze and spotted it. A large white truck parked near an old storage shed built against the lower slope of the mountain. The truck bore the blue logo of Cold Ridge Water, its engine rumbling softly, exhaust curling into the cold air. The windows were tinted. No one stepped out. It felt like the vehicle itself was watching. John stayed partially hidden behind a cluster of pines, his military instinct returning like muscle memory. He studied the scene with sharp eyes. A door to the storage shed hung slightly open, and faint metallic clanking echoed from inside. Whoever was there was in a hurry. Bruno's tail stiffened, his entire posture tense. John rested a steadying hand on the dog's back. The cold wind stung his cheeks, but the chill he felt was deeper than winter. Everything his grandmother wrote, everything the townspeople feared, it all pointed in the same direction. Something was wrong on this mountain, very wrong, and the people responsible didn't want anyone to know. The chapter closes as Bruno lets out a low growl, and John stands in the falling snow, watching the truck with a soldier's stillness, realizing Martha had been right all along. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. By mid-afternoon, a wall of gray clouds gathered over the distant peaks, swallowing the last traces of sunlight. The temperature dropped sharply, turning every breath into a plume of cold vapor. John Harrington stood outside the mountain house with Bruno at his side, fastening the shutters with practiced precision. The wind surged in short, angry bursts that rattled the cedar boards like a warning. He had lived through monsoon rains, desert winds, and firefights that made the very ground tremble. But there was something about a Montana blizzard that demanded respect. It was a force that erased trails, silenced voices, and stole lives without ever raising its voice. When they stepped back inside, John placed another log in the old stove. The flames crackled weakly, struggling to claim the cold air sweeping through the room. Bruno circled once near the door, restless, before lying down with his muzzle resting on his paws. John sank into the wooden chair beside the table where Martha's journal lay open, its pages rippling gently in the draft. He read her handwriting again, tracing each sentence with the patience of a man who feared losing the last thread that tied him to family. Outside, the wind escalated, turning the house into a fragile vessel stranded in a sea of white. Snow battered the round window, blurring the world into shifting shadows. John rubbed his forehead with a tired hand, the weight of everything he had discovered pressing on him like a rucksack from the old days. The mountain's pulse, the water vein, the drilling, the people in town who whispered but did not dare to act. Bruno lifted his head abruptly, his ears twitched, his body tense. Another gust of wind hit the wall, but the dog's reaction was sharper, deeper. He rose to his feet, stepping quietly toward the front door. John followed him with narrowed eyes. "What is it, boy?" The dog growled, a low, rumbling warning that resonated in John's ribs. He stepped closer, listening. At first he heard only the storm, the furious wind scraping against stone. Then, faintly, like a cry swallowed by snow, came a distant sound. It was not the howl of the wind. It was human, desperate, small, a plea hidden inside the blizzard's roar. John grabbed his coat, his gloves, and the flashlight hanging from a nail near the window. "All right, Bruno. If you're hearing it, we're going." He pushed the door open, and the storm crashed into him like a living thing. Snowflakes the size of feathers whipped across his face. Visibility was barely 2 meters. Bruno leapt ahead, nose low, tail straight, pulling John into the white wilderness. The climb down the ridge was treacherous. Snow drifts swallowed their boots, and icy winds clawed at their coats. But John moved forward with the endurance of a man shaped by long nights crossing terrains far worse. His breathing grew labored, but he kept pace with Bruno, who never hesitated for a moment. After nearly 20 minutes, Bruno stopped at the edge of a steep slope. John crouched beside him, shielding his eyes against the raging snow. Through the swirling white, he spotted it, a large truck lying at an angle, half buried under a fresh slide of snow. The blue logo of Cold Ridge Water was barely visible beneath the frost. Its rear wheels spun weakly, unable to grip the ice. 3 men stood outside, shouting over the wind. They appeared young, mid-20s to 30s, bundled in corporate winter jackets, faces pale and tight with fear. One held his arm, clearly injured. John slid down the slope, bracing his weight, Bruno close behind. His boots hit the snow beside the men, who stared at him with wide, startled eyes. "Anyone else inside?" John shouted. "The driver!" one of them yelled. He was a tall man with a narrow face, patchy beard, and dark eyes filled with panic. "Cab's smashed! He can't get out!" John didn't waste breath on reassurance. He approached the truck, assessing the damage. The front cabin had been crushed by the slide, metal folding inward like a crushed can. The windshield was cracked, blocking any visibility inside. He motioned for the men to step back, then turned to Bruno. "Stay close." He grabbed a loose rock wedged in the snow and used it to break what remained of the window. Glass shattered outward. Inside, he saw the driver, a man in his late 30s with dark brown skin, shaven head, and a neatly trimmed goatee. His face was streaked with blood from a cut above his eyebrow. He was conscious but disoriented, his breaths shallow. "Hang on," John said. "We're getting you out." He wedged his shoulder against the twisted metal frame, bracing his feet in the snow. Years of hauling wounded soldiers flashed through his muscles. Pain radiated down his back, but slowly the metal groaned and shifted. One of the younger workers rushed to help, a blond man with freckles and trembling hands. Together, they created a narrow gap. Bruno barked once, sharply, as if urging them on. John reached in, grasping the driver under the arm. "Pull with me," he commanded. The men obeyed. Inch by inch, they slid the injured driver free from the trapped space and lifted him into the open air. He gasped, the cold hitting him like a slap, but he was alive. "Get him up the ridge," John ordered. "My place is the closest shelter." The men supported their colleague as they climbed, stumbling through the snow. John followed beside them, guiding them toward the house. Bruno trotted ahead, clearing the path, occasionally glancing back to ensure the group remained intact. Inside the warm glow of the mountain house, John moved quickly. He laid blankets near the stove, brewed hot water, and checked the injured man's pulse. The room filled with the sound of storm winds muffled by stone walls and the cracking of wood in the stove. The rescued workers huddled together, shivering. One of them, a short, stocky man with a scar on his chin and tired, gray-blue eyes, reached into his coat with shaking fingers. He pulled out a wrinkled envelope, its edges bent from being handled too many times. His voice trembled when he tried to speak. "We took copies of the real drilling maps," he said. "They told us to push the rigs deeper, closer to the mountain wall, to save transport costs. We didn't know how bad it was until the pressure gauges went crazy. They warned us to keep quiet." His eyes filled with guilt. "But you saved us tonight. Please, save the town, too." The chapter ends as John holds the envelope, Bruno staring at the men with calm, alert eyes, and the storm continues to howl outside, sealing them inside with a truth larger than any of them expected. Morning came quietly, as if the storm had exhausted even the sky. The mountains lay covered in a white hush, and the air held a strange stillness, an aftertaste of danger mixed with the relief of survival. John Harrington stepped outside the mountain house, his boots sinking into snow so soft it whispered underfoot. Bruno patted beside him, tail swaying gently, his fur still carrying the faint warmth of the fire they had shared through the long night. Smoke curled from the chimney behind them, rising straight into the calm winter air. By the time John and Bruno reached town, news had already run ahead of them. People gathered in small clusters outside the diner, the general store, even the church steps. They spoke in excited, hushed tones, pointing toward the ridge as if it now held a legend rather than a simple house. The story grew with every retelling. The old Marine who marched into a blizzard, the loyal German shepherd who heard what others could not, the truck half swallowed by snow, the workers pulled from death. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere felt different from any meeting Coldridge had held in years. The long wooden benches were full, elderly couples wrapped in thick coats, young parents holding restless children, farmers with weather-toughened hands, teachers still smelling faintly of chalk dust. The walls, lined with old hunting trophies and faded photographs, seemed to lean inward, as if eager to hear the truth at last. At the front table sat the 5 members of the town council. Among them was Councilman Edwin Cooper, a man in his early 70s with a tall, rigid posture that made him appear carved from oak. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and his square jaw carried the clean-shaven precision of someone who believed discipline reflected morality. He had once run a small construction company and prided himself on practicality. Yet beneath his stern exterior was a man frightened of losing what little economic stability Coldridge still had. His eyes flickered anxiously as John entered the room. Beside him sat Councilwoman Sarah Delaney, a woman in her late 50s with a slender frame, auburn hair streaked by gray, and a warm, steady gaze. Her skin was pale from long winters and too many hours indoors reading reports. She had a quiet heart for justice, softened by raising 2 children alone after her husband's passing. Her hands folded atop a notepad, fingers tapping lightly. Impatience or hope, John couldn't tell. When John reached the podium, the room fell silent. Bruno sat precisely at his left side, alert, calm, a presence that made people straighten unconsciously. John laid the leather journal on the table. Its worn cover looked strangely powerful there amid official papers and microphones. He also set down the crumpled envelope the worker had given him the night before. He didn't speak immediately. He gathered his breath, letting his gaze travel across the room, faces marked by fatigue, worry, expectation. He had stood before larger crowds, harsher crowds, in places where a wrong word meant death. But this felt heavier, because these people were not strangers. This was his grandmother's town. "My grandmother," he began, voice steady but soft, "listened to this mountain all her life, and she tried to tell us when something was wrong." He opened the journal to the page where Martha's careful script described the weakening pulse of the water vein beneath the stone. He read the passage aloud. The words sounded older than ink, older than the mountain itself. Then he opened the envelope. Inside were maps stamped with the Coldridge Water Company's logo. Red lines marked the drilling sites. Some extended dangerously close to the structural layers of the ridge, far closer than any responsible surveyor would approve. Additional handwritten notes, scribbled by nervous hands, warned of pressure anomalies, rising fractures, and unexplained drops in underground flow. A ripple went through the crowd. John continued. Last night, during the storm, I pulled 4 workers out of a truck buried by a slide. They had these with them. They admitted the rigs were pushed deeper for profit. They admitted they knew it was wrong. Gasps and angry murmurs swelled. The council called up witnesses. One by one, elderly residents stood and spoke of wells that had dried for the first time in decades. Young mothers described sulfur-smelling water that made their children sick. A farmer spoke about cracked irrigation ditches, his voice shaking with frustration. Even Councilman Cooper's stern confidence began to crumble as he shuffled through the evidence, his jaw tightening not with denial but shame. Councilwoman Delaney stood. She wasn't tall, but her presence carried a quiet authority. "We have enough," she said, her voice clear. "We vote today." The decision was unanimous. All drilling near the mountain wall would cease immediately. A team of independent hydrologists would be brought in. The town would review every permit Cold Ridge water had been granted. When the meeting ended, people approached John in small waves. Some thanked him for listening when no one else had. Others apologized for ignoring Martha. A few simply placed their hands on his shoulder. No words necessary. Months passed. Winter softened into early spring, and the snow retreated into the valleys. Meltwater trickled through old channels, filling creeks that had not run full in years. The air smelled cleaner, sharper, like something had been lifted from the mountain's lungs. Cold Ridge decided to honor Martha Harrington by transforming her house on the ridge into a small educational station. The townspeople volunteered to help. Teachers brought students. Farmers brought tools. The Reverend brought books. They named it the Martha Harrington Listening Station. There, anyone, children, adults, visitors, could place headphones on their ears and listen to the quiet pulse beneath the stone, the heartbeat of the land. One late afternoon, when the sun hung warm and low, John sat on the porch steps with a chisel in hand. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, each drop catching a glint of golden light. Bruno rested his head on John's thigh, eyes half closed in contentment. John carved slowly into the wooden step. The letters formed clean and sure. Listen first. When he finished, he leaned back and gazed across the valley. The mountain's pulse hummed softly in the back of his mind, steady now, healed. John whispered, "I listened, Lord, and I know you never left." Bruno let out a deep, warm sigh, the kind that only comes when danger has passed and a home has finally been found. John placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the reassurance he had been missing for years. For the first time in a long while, he felt not like a man wandering, but a man returned, exactly where he was meant to be, called back to serve once more the people whose names he barely knew, yet whose future depended on him. In the quiet mountain town of Cold Ridge, one old Marine discovered something many of us forget in the rush of everyday life. Miracles rarely arrive with thunder or bright flashes. More often, they come as a whisper, a warning carried through a storm, a loyal dog who refuses to give up, or a memory from someone we once loved. John didn't save that mountain because he was strong. He saved it because he listened. And in the stillness of that ancient water beneath the stone, he finally understood the truth his grandmother had guarded all her life. God never abandons us. He simply waits for us to hear him again. Maybe that is the message for each of us today. In our homes, our families, our struggles, our fears, there is always a quiet voice guiding us back toward purpose, healing, and hope. All we have to do is pause, look up, and listen. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment, let us know your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of courage, faith, and everyday grace. May God watch over you, bless your home, strengthen your spirit, and guide your steps. Today and always,